And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And I'm delighted to have someone who I think we have all got to know as he has helped us through the last 5 years. And it's like, what does John Campbell think? Let's check it out. But it's Dr. John Campbell. John, thank you so much for your time today.
Peter, your reputation goes before you. Thank you very much for having me on.
No, not at all. It's I feel like what you have those wristbands, WWJD. What would Jesus do? It's
Yeah.
like, what would John say?
Oh, heck.
We should get those.
Don't put me in that category.
Maybe
Yeah.
we'll do that as
Yeah.
as a shop
I
later.
think we should maybe
Later on.
give a warning to any potential viewers out there that this is not AI, this is not rehearsed. So, what could possibly go wrong, Peter?
What could possibly go wrong? Now, John, obviously,
Hmm.
at Campbell Teaching is your handle on YouTube. I
Yeah.
think many people have really taken a lot away from those videos and the chaos that we find ourselves. And you're looking for a voice of reason, and in you, we seem to find that. But I would like, and I knew 3,000 videos. I was feeling quite a little bit impressed with myself, having done 800 interviews, and then I look and you've got 3K, and you think, oh dear. So respect to you for such sticking at something, but providing such a large catalog of information for the viewers to just take and enjoy. Really,
Yeah, I was amazed. They just seem to keep accumulating. I started doing videos. I'm not quite sure. It was either 1991 or 1992 when I first started my full-time teaching job. In those days, we had the big chunky VHS tapes that your dad's probably told you about, and then we went on to DVDs, and then we had this really bizarre phenomenon called dematerialization, where you don't have a physical object; it's all somewhere out there that some techies probably understand. Elon Musk would understand, but ordinary people like me just use the facility. So it's been going on for some time. Yeah.
wow. But I want to ask you a little bit about your background nursing. What lessons for life did you learn by being a psychiatric nurse? I guess from your training, what kind of do you take? And maybe I'll ask you now what you would put back on into the teaching. But what
Yeah.
kind of life lessons did you take away from it?
What a good question. I started as a first year student psychiatric nurse about 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. And so I finished the training 3 weeks after my 21st birthday. And then I did what you call general nurse training after that. And in those days, it was a sort of shorter 18-month course. And I guess, when you look back at the end of that 4.5 year period, you realize that you're kind of a different person through all those experiences you've been through. But there again, that's the time you kind of grow up anyway, isn't it? If we look at the 18-year-olds as opposed to the 22, 23-year-old Peter, you've really changed from a boy to a man in many ways. And it's kind of hard to unpick it sometimes. But I worked in the proper old-fashioned psychiatric hospital. And they were still in the days it was really a total institution in those days. So, there'd be the charge nurses, and one of their sons would maybe be a student, and the cousins would maybe be the baker. And it was really quite an all-round institution, and they got a lot of stick really since then. It wasn't this terrible that we incarcerated people, but I see people around now with patent psychiatric pathology, just wandering around or sitting on park benches or getting into trouble or arguably worse, undergoing intolerable suffering and stress. Because psychiatric illness does cause real suffering, the same as any physical illness will. And the good thing about those days was that, yeah, people might be in for a long time and the rehabilitation wasn't where we'd like it to be. But kind of within a few weeks of starting your training, you knew where you stood. And pretty well the system was okay. There was some abuse, there is in everything, but basically it was benign. Basically people were trying to do their best. And people with severe mental health difficulties kind of knew where they stood. And it gave them a kind of foothold on reality. So if you talk about something like psychosis, schizophrenia is the classic one, perhaps the best description of that is it's a detachment from reality. In psychosis, the person is no longer living in reality. So if you've got like a neuroses, a neurotic condition, as we used to do, well, we still use that division, there, anxiety, depression, things like that, the people still know the nature of reality. Now, they might see the nature of reality in a very distorted way. They might think I'm a terrible person and there is no hope, which is not true. There is hope. There's always hope. There's always hope. That's why suicide is such a tragedy. If someone commits suicide when the balance of their mind is disturbed, but that can be improved. It's an awful tragedy. But in psychosis, that foothold in reality is kind of gone. But my patients knew they would get the lunch at 12 o'clock. They knew they would get the tea at 6:30. They knew they would get the medicines after tea. They knew they could play snooker at 7 o'clock. They knew they watch telly at 8 o'clock. And that kind of kept them rooted in reality. That routine, that resort to mundanity, really helped. And I really feel we've lost a lot since then. But what do you learn? You learn something. I mean, you never understand this. It's a lifelong study, but you learn something of human nature. By seeing how it goes wrong, you learn a little bit about what it is to be normal, perhaps. You learn to communicate with people. You learn to understand people. You learn to listen. And very often there's practical things that you can do. Very often we're not talking about cure, but we are talking about really quite significant improvement. And I feel quite a lot of that has sadly been lost. Obviously in my career since, because, when you learn when you're young, you tend not to forget. And you notice psychiatric pathology and you notice psychotic ideas, you notice depressive thinking. And also, perhaps most alarming of all, you can recognize personality disorder thinking. These days, that is usually called sociopathy. We used to call it psychopathy. But, there are a very small proportion of the people who can manipulate things pragmatically, regardless of the cost of others, to their own benefit. And you recognize that very occasionally in people you come across directly. But you do recognize it in people that have reached, shall we say, more exalted positions that we might see on the media. You think, just a minute. That's using people as people as things. People as entities on a chessboard. Maybe that's an indication of a personality disorder. And I'd like to give you some examples, but of course I wouldn't dare. But of course, I'm sure viewers will have their own views on this, Peter, which is quite interesting.
Can I ask you, because again, you look at where we are now and you think things have changed, but it may always have been that the profession was very politicized. I guess you always have a government minister, whether it's West Streeting or whoever it is, not knowing anything about the medical profession, as is every minister. Maybe it's always been not just politicized, but big pharmacized, I guess, the control that they play. I mean, has it changed, or has it always been the political and the pharma kind of control on how medicine works?
I think we've always had arguably over reliance on simple drugs, the pill for every ill type thing. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But first of all, to answer the first part of your question, yes, things have very much changed. So when I started, there's only you and me listening at the moment, so I'll tell you when I started, 1975. And at that point, we were still kind of in the old system. So I think it was the year before I started, for the whole psychiatric hospital, there was one guy did the wages. Wow. He might have had a couple of assistants, but basically one guy did the wages. So if there's a problem with the wages, ring him up, he'd sort it out. Local guy who did that. We had one baker who baked fantastic tray bakes and fresh bread every day. And, we had this idea that we had our own tradesmen. We had our own morgue. None of this importing food from halfway down the country. It was all cooked on site. And then there was something introduced that I never understood, but it was something called the Salmon Report. I think it came out about 74, 75, just before I started. And we had this process called salmonization. So this is what introduced like the hierarchy. I think this is where nursing officers were introduced. And so instead of having staff nurses, sisters, and a deputy matron and a matron, we had staff nurses, charge nurses, nursing officers, senior nursing officers, blah, 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 dead high up nursing officers. It became a bit of a hierarchical thing. And some of them were excellent, but a lot of people that got into these positions were good at administration and things like that. And, good at organizing systems. And that's not always beneficial. So we went away into the sort of management structure. And then later on in hospitals, we had the introduction of general managers, general business managers, finance managers, entrepreneurial managers, all these things that weren't there in the early 70s. Around about, it was changing just when I started. So we've moved on from what I would call a hospital system to a sort of business managerial system. I mean, when I trained, when you passed your you had, I think you had internal exams before you did your final exams. You got your hospital badge, and each hospital has its badge for registered and enrolled nurses. And this was a real point of pride. Each hospital had its badge, and when someone came in, you could say, "Oh, you trained at Guy's," or wherever. You could tell by the badges. There was that sense of pride and localization, and things became more and more disseminated, more and more diffuse, harder and harder to get anyone to take responsibility. Whereas in the past, if there was a problem, the matron would say, "Well, I'll sort that out." The buck had somewhere to stop. There was the chief medical officer who was in charge of the doctors. That is now kind of diffuse. In terms of the whole pharma thing, the history of this is long and complicated, and I don't pretend to understand it. But, going back to the Rockefellers, we went on to the sort of, I suppose we're talking about 1870s, I don't know, the historians will tell us 1880s. There was this move away from the wisdom of the people, the natural remedies that people use, the herbal remedies. I mean, when my dad was 2 years old, he got pneumonia. I don't think I've told anyone this story before. It's just come to mind. He got pneumonia, and the doctor came round and said, "We've got to get him to the hospital." And my papa, my granddad, my dad's dad, said, "No, I'm going to go to the local herbalist and get him something." And the doctor said, "Mr. Campbell, you're mad," and just walked out, just left it. And he got this stuff, and my dad was better in a few days. So without
what was it? What was it? You need to know.
No, the pharmacist closed down in about 1960. I wish I'd gotten around with a microphone and pumped him for all the information that I could get out of him. So, I mean, in that case, that's just one story, really. But I suppose it's important because I might not have been here, which we could argue about the merits or benefits of that. But this move away from the traditional means. If you go to, I was talking to someone yesterday with a trapped nerve in his leg, and basically you could go to a neurosurgeon if it was really bad, or you could take some pills, but the pills aren't going to get rid of the physical problem. This is why we need physiotherapy and good osteopaths and chiropractors. We need all these things that kind of work together and integrate. At the moment, they're kind of working in silos. Each silo somewhat poo-pooing the other, particularly the medical silo poo-pooing other options. Another part of the problem there is that a lot of what we do in healthcare now is based on guidelines, expert opinion. So we have evidence-based medicine, and that is a really good idea. So evidence-based medicine is based on the best available research findings. It's based on expert opinion and a combination of expert opinion. And it's also based on what is acceptable to the patient, the three-legged stool of evidence-based medicine. And of course, all of those stools, all of those legs should be there. We should have the best available evidence. That should concur with combined expert opinion, and it should be something that's acceptable to the patient. We should achieve what we call concordance with the patient. The trouble is, I think the expert opinion bit has kind of grown somewhat now. So what we have is national guidelines. So we have this National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK. I was a bit comfortable when people call themselves excellent. If you'd written to me and said, this is the excellent Peter, I'd like to have you on my podcast, I think, well, this guy thinks he's excellent. He's probably not excellent. You know?
Exactly.
It's the same as democratic, isn't it? You know, any country that's put democratic in its title probably isn't democratic. Anyway, I digress. So this health and character. So people go by these guidelines. So what I found is, going back to clinical practice after getting on for 30 years as a lecturer, academic teacher, that a big difference I noticed was doctors wouldn't think, oh, we've got this new patient here, let me have a think about it. They'd say, oh, we've got this new patient, they haven't seen this condition for a while. And then they'd say to the juniors, go and look up the guidelines. You know, and they follow the guidelines. Now, that can be really, really good, because these guidelines are written by panels of experts. And the opinions of a panel of experts is probably likely to be better than one random doctor in one random part of the country. But the problem is, if you go against these guidelines, then the first question that would be asked is, if something goes wrong, is, well, did you follow the guidelines, doctor? If the answer is no, then, well, why weren't you following the guidelines? Do you think you know better than all these experts? Do you think you know better than these national guidelines? So understandably, people are frightened to depart from the guidelines. But the point is, what gets into the guidelines? Well, if they're well written, that which is in the literature gets into the guidelines, so that the guidelines are informed by the best available evidence. So far, so good. That's exactly what we want. But then you've got to say, well, what gets into the journals? Well, things that are taken, ideally, large scale, randomized, well organized, double blind controlled trials gets into the journals. Good. So far, so good. But when the problem starts is, well, who pays for the trials? How are these trials done? What trials are selected to be done? What trials are selected not to be done? What is promoted? What is suppressed? How are the statistics analyzed? Because you can analyze statistics in a whole load of different ways to give you a whole load of different outcomes. It's nothing like as objective, and it becomes subjective. And you could argue that what is in the journals, is a product of a vested interest that promotes its own products while denigrating, poo-pooing other potentially really, really good ideas. So it's quite conceivable that while we've got some really good stuff there, we've actually got some pretty distorted stuff as well. So I think that's a large part of the problem. Combining with that, a very great reluctance to incorporate holistic, conventional, alternative approaches. In fact, even the term alternative is somewhat derisory, isn't it? Because it's saying, well, ideally you afford this high-tech modern medicine. If you can't quite get that, there's an alternative here. You know, maybe that's not an adequate term, because, you know, there are things that can have dramatic beneficial consequences that aren't directly pharmaceutically related. So well, that's a big part of the problem. The slavery to guidelines and the slavery to one pill for every ill or several pills for every ill. And then, of course, you end up with polypharmacy, all the problems of that, all the adverse reactions. And, you know, we tend to ignore things like lifestyle. I think I'll go to the pub tonight. I'll have half a dozen pints. I'll have fish and chips on the way home. I quite fancy that. I certainly won't be doing any exercise. I'll just slob around. But tell you what, doctor, give me a pill and make it all right, will you? Well, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work. It doesn't work like that.
No, but I guess part of it comes from this understanding that we are so enlightened that actually everything that went before, what did they know? Because we now live in the 21st century, and therefore we have reached a higher level of intellect. But I want to take that a little bit. I'd love to go deeper into kind of the respect and the trust that we have in the medical profession. But there was a video, you've done a number of them. I was watching the recent one on the Turin Shroud.
Yeah.
And I wanted to delve into this. It was Dr. Richard Sorensen.
Yeah.
And really interesting. And this follows one you did previously that's had a few million views. There's a
Yeah,
really
yeah,
big,
well over 2 million. Yeah,
well, there's a really big, and it is this about kind of faith and science. And I guess that
yeah,
fits with this new enlightened level that humanity have now reached, and we can look at disdain on everyone who is before. But maybe just on that, before we go wider on the kind of faith and science, um, how did you end up doing a video on the Turin Shroud? It kind
yeah,
of, it's a bit out of kilter, is it? How did that happen?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like your point there about the delusion of the inevitability of human progress. And we could talk about that for a long time, but it is delusional. Progress is not inevitable. We can go backwards. There is the potential for a new dark age, a dystopian dark age, a terrifying prospect. But let's go on to the shroud thing, which is actually much more interesting. Um, when I was young, about 1978, there was this. I think it was 78. There was this Shroud of Turin research project, and this group did some research on it, on the shroud. First proper scientific research, really, arguably, and they produced some really interesting ideas on it. And then about 10 years later, I heard that the carbon dating had come back as being Middle Ages. So then I realized that everything to do with the shroud must be wrong, because the carbon dating trumps everything. And looking back, how could my thinking be so simplistic as that? So naive as that? When the carbon dating is now, you know, debunked is too strong a word, but certainly open to complete questioning, and is almost certainly inaccurate. The thing that struck me about that, first of all, was the pathology on the shroud. So it's really quite a terrifying thing to study. But the shroud, when I started to look at it, and there's quite a few books around, I started looking at this in much more detail a couple of years ago. I've since heard that there's a British Shroud of Turin Society, which I've just joined. So I'm looking forward to talking to a lot more local experts on this fairly soon. But I started off looking at the pathology, and you have pathology on the Shroud of Turin that shows a crucified man. And what is strange about it is the image is in negative. It's a negative image. Now, if you're young and you take all your pictures on one of these things, that might not mean very much to you. But in the old days, even when I started photography, we used to take, because it was cheap, we used to develop our own. And you put a film in, Ilford MP4, we used to get in big rolls or whatever it was. And then you developed it, and then you got your negatives, where your whites are blacks and your blacks are white. Everything's back to front. And then you use an enlarger to turn that into your positive. So the shroud is a negative. So why should it be a negative? This was only discovered actually in 1898. A guy called Secondo Pia took a picture of it. And in his dark room, when he was developing the negative, ready to prepare the positive, he realized it actually got the positive in the negative. and that was the first time that had been discovered. And then later on, there was something called a VP8 image analyzer. And that was developed for moon landings and analyzing the surface of planets, where you could take the grayscale in a picture and convert that into topographical information, into height and distance. And when you do that, when you put a two-dimensional photograph into that, you get a distorted picture. But there's one image in the world where you put it in a VP8 image analyzer, and the grayscale is converted into a picture that really makes sense. The only image in the world, the only one. And of course, it's the shroud. You get this three-dimensional information that's encoded into it. And you've got the pathology of crucifixion that first, sparked my interest, I suppose. And it's basically too vile to go into, but the Romans knew how to do it. They knew how to torture people. And, for example, to breathe in a crucified position, you have to push up with your feet, which have got nails in, and you can see this zigzagging on the blood marks. You can see this. You've got the other marks of the gospel crucifixion. You've got the scourging, which is excessive all over the body, enough to kill probably most men, the scourging alone, but with particularly vile Roman implements of torture. Then, of course, you've got the crown of thorns. You've got which covered the whole head, the blood stains from that. You've got the wound in the side, the wound in the right side, which will go through the lungs into the pericardial sac. You've got all these things that come together and actually make horrific, perfect sense. And then I read what various pathologists and doctors have talked about it, and it all kind of hangs together. Then you've got so many other things, like the blood, for example, is AB blood group. We know it's human blood. People have analysed it. We know it's male human blood, group AB. The weave of the shroud is as you would expect. Similar samples have been found in Masada, which fell to the Romans in probably about AD 74, something like that. You've got the pollen analysis, which shows the history of the shroud. You've got dirt samples from the nose and the feet of the individual, which show the particular type of geology which is present in Jerusalem. So many things like that all fit together. So either this was the burial shroud of Christ, or someone who was subject to the same torture narrative as in the biblical account, in the same place at the same time, or very shortly afterwards. You've got the history of the shroud. It became something called the image of Edessa. When you show someone a picture of the shroud who's never seen it before, they'll say, oh, that's Jesus.
Yes, that's true.
So how do they know that? Well, the images of Jesus go back to about 550. So the idea is that the shroud was hidden for a period of time during a period of persecution. It came out, and the icons that were produced in that era were described as the image not made by human hands. Now, of course, the icons were painted. But there's one in St. Catherine's Monastery, which is about 550, mid-6th century. And it's got that classical picture of Christ. It's got the long hair parted in the middle, the beard with a bit of a V in the middle. You know, what does it say in Isaiah? They plucked out my beard. You know, it's all there. And this image has been perpetuated through 1,500 years now. So people recognize it. Put all those things together, and it becomes really quite convincing. But the most convincing thing of all, perhaps, is the image itself. How did it get there? Now, I've sadly put quite a few people in quite a few shrouds, but I've never seen an image. In like 50 years of working with people and death, sadly, I once saw this amazing. So the patient leaked some bile at the time of death, and the bile went around the hand, and it made like this perfect handprint. It was really quite surreal. But of course, I've never seen any full body image, nothing like that. And of course, that image was the image in the bile I saw was caused by direct contact. The thing about the image on the shroud is that some parts of the shroud, which was wrapped over the body, some parts were in direct contact with the body, but other parts weren't. And the image is of the whole body. So parts of the body that weren't in contact with the shroud still produced a negative image on the shroud. And that means that there was a gap between the body and the shroud. And the only thing I can think of that goes over a physical gap is radiation, which raises really quite interesting questions. And some people have suggested that this radiation was the actual energy of the resurrection. Now, of course, that's not testable, but it is interesting. It is the only image of its type ever discovered in the history of humanity. It still can't be duplicated today. And yet it exists. Scientists have tried to duplicate it and basically haven't been able to do so. So it's a deeply, deeply mysterious image. Now, this is not what makes or breaks faith, of course, but it's one of these things that appear to me to be highly consistent with it. And for me, personally, being forced to think about the image and what the person on that image went through to understand something of that pathology. Sometimes when I'm thinking about it, I say I have to stop. I just can't. Emotionally, I just can't cope with that level of. I can't understand that level of voluntary suffering. It's something I would recommend everyone to look at. I can send you some links. There's a really good film that's freely available on it. Much better than my video. Yeah, people can watch it for themselves and think about it. So whether it's genuine or not, and my personal view is that it is. I can't see how it could be forged. Okay, someone could win a Nobel Prize next year for proving how it could all be forged. Fair enough. Doesn't change anything. But I've just found it something really beneficial just to spend time thinking about, and that was my experience of it, and hope to go on learning more.
It is, because the crucifixion extremely gruesome, and when you read about it, you can read in the Gospels, and it explains it. But I guess, yeah, it's not, as you mentioned, it doesn't affect your faith, doesn't affect my faith. Your faith position or worldview does not depend on whether that is correct or not. It doesn't depend on whether, with the many new advances in historical checks, with you go to the British Library and the British Museum, and you can see many artifacts that fit in with stories throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So that builds, and that kind of adds, but it doesn't take away or from someone who is a Christian, because it's faith. But yeah, when you look at that image, to think that you could be looking face to face at Christ, then you're right. You just sit and you think, wow, it could be. If it's not, it doesn't change faith, but actually it's part of the conversation of what faith is and what happened 2,000 years ago, I guess.
There's two things. The emotional responses inside part of you just crumples. You think, am I looking at the face of Jesus here? And when you look at the AI reconstructions, it gets even more incredible, although they're obviously open to some question. I think to be more objective, if there were scientific inconsistencies with Christian faith, that would concern me. That would concern me. But so far, after studying this for, I guess, 50 years now, I haven't found any. So if there were things that were, blatantly contradictory, that would concern me, because science proper science does work. Science at its best is human endeavors to understand the nature of reality. And okay, we're limited as an individual. Of course we're limited. But, there are some things that we're actually got a pretty good idea about. Very often how it actually works is based on a somewhat simplistic model. I might be able to write you a chemical equation now, but I haven't got a clue what's going on at the quantum level in the chemistry. But that doesn't kind of matter, because I know, if I follow the recipe, it's going to vaguely work out. The Apollo engineers could send a rocket off to the moon, and of course, when they sent the rocket off to the moon wasn't there. The moon had to go to the right place to meet up with it. Hey, it just meets at the right time, in the right place. All these things about the nature of reality that are predictable, does show that science actually works to a large extent. So if there's inconsistencies, that would concern me, but I don't think there is. No. In fact, let me just say this before you ask the question. Many things actually substantiate the design hypothesis, really. Now it gets very confusing here, because especially in the States, if I've got any American friends watching, they tend to have a firm divide between sort of people who believe the science and people who have one particular interpretation. But anyone who's read Genesis and comes to a firm conclusion about it, maybe read it again, because it's rather difficult to come to firm conclusions. So if someone comes to you and say, Peter, I've got the book of Revelation all worked out. I know what it means now. Oh, have you? That's interesting. There's some things that maybe probably we're not supposed to understand. There's some things that really are supposed to be held in tension all throughout human life. And, you have to approach this with a very hefty dose of humility. But I think there's so many things about the nature of reality that have to be exactly as they are, that, the coincidences add up to so many areas of science and so many endeavors that basically it becomes impossible to be coincidence.
No, that and the issue of science, I guess you go back hundreds of years, and when there was a scientific discovery, it had to be approved by the church because it was that dogma. Now we've moved over to the other side that actually science tells us everything, and I think the term is scientism. That
Scientism, yeah.
yeah, that is the absolute uh, proof. That is moving into a religious ideology. How tell us about that? Because I think we always seen science being a tool to help us understand the world, as opposed to actually the be all and end all defining. And now we're moving towards there is no kind of confusion or doubt that it's only this absolute science
Yeah.
that tells us right and wrong.
Mm. Yeah. Someone once said that when people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, it's that they'll believe anything.
Yes.
And you certainly see some weird ideas around. And my question, but I agree with Richard Dawkins on this. He said, when someone tells you an idea or a belief, say, "Oh, really? And what's your evidence for that?" Couldn't agree with him more. We might disagree on other things. Come on the podcast, Professor. We'd love to have you. It's we'd have a great. No, I'm serious. We'd have a great chat. I've got a lot of respect for him. But what's your evidence for that? And we need to be able to give evidence for things. And scientism is this idea that science is the only possible answer. It's the only possible mechanism. I mean, many problems with that is, firstly, we don't understand science fully, of course not. And secondly, there's some questions that perhaps it's never going to answer. And even if it did answer, it wouldn't adjudicate on my fate as an individual human being, as an individual soul. It's nothing to say about the individual really, but we're still left with interesting questions like, I don't know, why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, that's kind of a trite thing. It's often thrown out, but matter, energy, space, and time exist. Well, how come? Why is there not nothing? Well, you've got to go back to a beginning, and perhaps this is the Big Bang creation event 14.7 billion years ago. In saying that, we're probably going to upset some American viewers that say, no, the Earth is only 8,000 years old. But I would say, be cautious how you interpret Genesis and other parts of scriptures. There was a time when there wasn't anything. Now we have all of this. It's quite incredible. How did that happen? Well, normally we think that everything needs a cause. So before there was matter, energy, space, or time, there was no matter, energy, space, or time. There was no universe. And yet we have a universe. So what was it that caused the universe? But then, of course, Richard Dawkins will say, well, if you believe God caused the universe, who caused God? But that's where you get up to the limitations of human understanding, because the idea that Christian philosophy tends to put forward, and I'm not an expert in this, but you have to trace back eventually to an uncaused reality. So what caused the universe? Well, the previous universe caused the universe. There was a big bang, then a big crunch, which there probably isn't. Okay, what caused that previous universe? Well, universe Y caused that. Well, what caused that? Well, universe X caused that. And you can go back and this argument is called turtles all the way down. You're standing on the back of a turtle. Eventually, you've got to come, given that there is something rather than nothing. Is it that you've got to come to an uncaused cause? that seems a plausible idea. You know, and another problem that science has got no clue at all, is how did the first life originate? Origin of life researchers. So if you go to the average person in the street and say, you know, where did life come from? And say, oh, evolution. Darwin proved it all. Well, Darwin was one heck of a clever dude. I've got a lot of admiration for Charles Darwin and his work, both as a man and as a scientist. But he showed how you would get evolution of a replicator. You had to have a replicator. How do you get that first replicator? Now, if you listen to people say, you know, we've got some pretty good ideas on how the first life came about. Well, actually, we don't. So if you take Sir Paul Nurse, for example, leader of the Francis Crick Institute in London, Nobel Prize winner, biologist, lifelong scientist. You know, I heard him on a program recently. So we've got no idea. We haven't got a clue how life started. No, you have to have a minimum of 400 genes and 400 gene products in a reproducing structure, you know, with all the proteins. You know, we've no idea how that happened. Now, once you've got to that stage, then you can employ Darwinian mechanisms. But how we get what we call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, there's no idea about that. You know,
but I mean, sorry, mention that picks up. I remember 2 interviews. Eric Metaxas, I think, is Atheism Dead was his book. Phenomenal book on the impossibility that everything can come together and make life as is. And he just takes a number of compounds and explains. And then, of course, Dr. Stephen C. Mayer talking about the complexity of the cell. And you begin to delve into that. And kind of, as a Christian, you kind of think, well, in the beginning, God, that kind of might explain how you have all of this coming. But that complexity, and science argues, well, we know it all. We can fix it all. Really? Because there seems to be a lot of unknown in terms of this.
Absolutely. We can come back to that one. But another good example, the 3 I normally give together, is something rather than nothing, the first life. And the other is, well, who the heck are you?
Yes.
Consciousness. Yes. You know, are you aware that you are an individual? Are you aware of your surroundings? Can you manipulate your surroundings? When you close your eyes, Peter, do you know you exist? And of course, the answer to that question is yes, of course you do. But your brain's just made out of the dust of the earth. Looks a bit like a bowl of porridge. Now, in fact, it's probably about 80,000. This keeps changing. It's about 80 billion nerve cells, I think, is the latest figure from that I got from Dr. David Nutt, the psychiatrist, when I talked to him. You know, each with probably a couple of thousand synaptic interconnections. You know, it's the most complicated structure in the universe, but it's just the dust of the earth. How come that gives rise to human consciousness? We have no idea. There's no theory in town about this. So, you know, I remember when I was a kid, people said, "Oh, it's probably like a very complicated mechanical machine." Then they said, "Oh, it's probably like a very complicated digital computer." And now people are saying, "Oh, it's probably some sort of quantum mechanical effect." You know, so whatever science is around at the moment, they're trying to equate that to the way that the brain generates consciousness. But it's none of these things. You know, it's just a complete mystery. But the idea that everything has to be exactly right is an interesting one. So we haven't rehearsed this, but give me one thing about the nature of the Earth. One thing about the nature of the Earth. One thing about geology. You know, anything that you've observed. Try.
Well, I mean, the size of it, mass.
Size and mass of the Earth. Let's go with that. So why is the Earth the size and the mass that it is? Well, it's just the right distance from the sun, and it's just the right size to generate just the right amount of gravity that's consistent with human biochemistry. But why is it the size and the mass that it is? Well, what seems to have happened is, and again, I don't want to upset young Earth creationists who believe that this all happened spontaneously. You can believe that. But the standard scientific explanation for this is that when the Earth was formed, it was probably about 4.6 billion years ago. And about 4.2 billion years ago, there was a collider called Theo that collided another protoplanet. Two protoplanets collided. That generated an immense amount of heat. A lot of basalt and rock was thrown up into the Earth's orbit, and that condensed to form the moon, is what most lunar scientists now believe. But the metals from this collider combined with the metals in the Earth, and they were molten, heavier, therefore they sank to the core. So what have we got now? Well, we've got an Earth orbiting the Earth, and coincidentally, the mass of that Earth, the mass of that moon orbiting the Earth is just enough to stabilize our rotational axis at 23 degrees or whatever it is these days. It's just the right amount. It's just the right amount to give us the tides. It's just the right amount to synchronize, help with the seasons. Just the right mass in just the right orbit, which of course no other planet has got. Other planets have got moons, but nothing like as big in relation to the size of the Earth. But all this iron sank to the core of the Earth. So we have an iron core. And iron, of course, is a magnetic element. So this generates magnetic fields. So the Earth is surrounded by magnetic fields. This is why your compass works. So when Captain Cook wanted to discover Australia, he could follow his compass. But more importantly than that, this generates magnetic fields. I think they're called Van Allen belts. And the solar wind comes along, charged particles from the sun at really high speed. And instead of going to the surface of the Earth, they're actually deflected magnetically around the Earth. That's why we get the aurora at the North and the South poles. It's these solar particles from the sun coming into the Earth and generating these beautiful colors that you can see. I've never seen it myself, but I've seen it on pictures. So if that wasn't happening, if we didn't have this magnetic field, like Venus has it, for example, all the atmosphere would probably have been washed away by this solar wind. And of course, without an atmosphere, you don't get us. And also in that collision, it imparted just the right amounts of a couple of isotopes of uranium. They can never remember them now. Is it 235 and something? Anyway, there's one isotope that's got a half-life of about 500 million years, something like that. One that's got a much longer half-life. And this uranium, combined with the lower part of the Earth crust, lower parts of the Earth crust, generates heat. And that heat causes rocks to melt. And that makes the rocks fluid, so they glide over each other. And this is what's called plate tectonics. So we have plate tectonics. So two plates bump into each other and you get mountains, you get the Himalayas. Now, if we didn't have geology and plate tectonics, what you'd have is the lighter stuff at the top, the atmosphere, then the water, then the hydrosphere, then you'd have the geosphere below. You see, that means there's no land. So it's plate tectonics that give us dry land. And it gives us just the right amount of dry land. So we've got just the right amount of dry land, balanced by the heat stabilizing properties of just the right amount of ocean, with the right amount of phytoplankton to generate the right amount of oxygen to sustain life. So, going right back to that collision, you had to have exactly the right collider. If it hit us bang on, it might have smashed us to pieces and would have flown all over the solar system. If it had hit us too acutely, it would have bounced off and we wouldn't have had the formation of the Earth's field. We had just the right amount of mass in just the right amount of mass at just the right time with just the right angle to generate just the right amount of... Can you see what I mean? Everything's just right. Everything's just right. And that's assuming you've got the laws of physics and chemistry, which are also just right. That's assuming you've got the expansion of the cosmos, which is also just right. Physicists I've read saying that the expansion of the universe has to be fine-tuned in 1 part in 10 to the 40th. That's 1 with 40 noughts. That's a silly large number. That's like the number of grains of sand on the surface of the earth or something. It's crazy numbers. But without that, if everything expanded too quickly, it would all fly apart. If it was a little slower, it would all crunch back together again. But it expanded at just the right rate. So stars would form with just the right amounts of electromagnetism, with just the right amount of gravity, with just the right amount of fusion reactions to form what we call the periodic table.
Wow.
Those supernovas that formed our Earth went boom just at the right time to put all of these, astronomers call it metallicity, put all of these heavier elements into the gravitational attraction of our forming star. This attracted them at just the right amount of time into just the right amounts of orbits to coalesce into the proto-Earth and into Theo, just at the right place at just at the right time. There's parts of the universe, for example, that don't have various elements. I think fluoride is one. So fluoride, we need fluoride to survive. We don't want too much of it. So some of these elements are only produced in particular stars in particular places at particular times. This was largely developed by a local guy called Fred Hoyle, who worked all this out in the 50s and 60s. How the heavier elements fuse together inside stars. And when he actually worked out how these fusion reactions took place to form the heavier elements, he said it looks like someone's been monkeying with the laws of physics to get the elements that we've got, particularly oxygen. He couldn't work out oxygen. You have to need all sorts of jiggery pokery inside the star. Get a physicist on who will explain it to you. But Fred Hoyle's conclusion was, it looks like this is a put-up job. And Fred Hoyle, of course, was a well-known, I'm sure he died an atheist. All of these things need to be just right. The amount of water on the Earth, well, at this time, all this heat will get rid of all the Earth's water. It will all go into space. But we've got just the right amount of water. Well, that must have come after in comets and stuff. Just the right amount came at just the right time to fill the ocean basins. Everything needs to be exactly right. So, yes, fine, believe it's all coincidence if you like. Which is kind of easier to believe than understand your own consciousness, which is also perhaps the deepest mystery of all. So all these things fit together to give a worldview, which to me necessitates a mind and intelligence.
No, it does. It's interesting how people come to two opinions. One, you look at the complexity of something and you come to the view that it just must have appeared overnight. And the other view is that you had a designer. I mean, I studied aerospace engineering, and you look at an aircraft and you think, well, try putting the parts of a Boeing 747 and coming back the next day and it's all been made. No one would, and you'd be crazy if you actually put forward that view. And yet many put forward the view that actually it just all came together and kind of we're here and we'll move on. And yet we think we've sorted that out. And yet we can't even send a man to our nearest planet.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're so intelligent. It's interesting how people come to two very separate conclusions. One, there has to be some intelligent designer here. Is that God asking questions? Or actually, it was just you go to bed one night and you wake up and it's there.
It's weird. That goes back to William Paley finding the watch on the beach, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, I found a watch on the beach.
Yes.
You know what? It just happened. No, I think it's more likely someone put it together. No. All the bits just happened to come together and just, this is a purely natural event that this watch exists. And of course, Richard Dawkins debunked that. He wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker. If evolution is a watchmaker, then it's a blind watchmaker. But of course, there's counter arguments to that, which we could rehearse, but we will be here all day. But to go back to the crux of your question there, Peter, I think this idea that there's two groups of people, that's true. That's true, there is. But amongst leading physicists, especially physicists, but all scientists, there's actually the realization that the universe we have, with exactly the same, with the strength of the law of gravity, the strength of the law of electromagnetism, the strength of the weak nuclear force, the strength of the strong nuclear force, all these being exactly right, is a bit of a coincidence. They realize that. So what they've proposed now is they're saying, well, we're here in this universe which is just right. If this universe wasn't just right, then we wouldn't be here to appreciate this universe which is just right, which has got a certain amount of logic to it. But they say that all of these parameters that are just right needn't have been that way. We've just hit lucky. We hit the one universe that was lucky, incredibly lucky, but the one universe that was lucky. So what we must live in, the ultimate nature of reality, must be what they call a multiverse. In other words, there's an infinite number of universes out there, and we just hit the lucky one. Now, you and me can't understand what infinite means. Thankfully, we're protected from that. There's some things that we're protected from, otherwise we'd go completely mad. But the idea of a multiverse is a postulated belief. Because it's external to our universe, you can never prove it. So we've got leading scientists who believe this idea of the multiverse because they can't accept the fact that we're the only one that's just right. Therefore, there must be an infinite number of universes where things were maybe partly right, but not right enough to generate us. So we've got some of the leading scientific brains in the world who believe in a multiverse to explain our single just right universe. And for a multiverse, there is no evidence. So you could say that the multiverse is a religious belief. So they're so desperate to scramble away from everything being just right that they have this postulated multiverse, which of course you can never prove. So yes, some people do say, never mind, let's go for a drink. I can't work it all out, which is you can understand that. It still doesn't explain your individual consciousness, though. And the fact that you kind of know deep down inside you that individual consciousness won't end with your death. People kind of know that. Remember that scripture that says God has put eternity into the heart of a man and a woman. If you close your eyes, you do kind of know that. But people that try and stay true to science come up with this ludicrous, quasi-religious idea of the multiverse, which is an expression, I suppose, of scientism, but completely ridiculous.
It's kind of anything but God. Could I just me to finish on one area, connecting this to the medical field? I've been impressed. I think Naomi Wolf, some of her videos talking about actually herbology, and it kind of fits into the story of your father whenever he was 2. And let's actually look at what is available. We've moved from actually the mind is we are so enlightened that we actually can design everything, but actually it seems as though the world we are in not only has it all come together perfectly, but it seems to have the compounds and elements that we need to help us survive. So it goes above and beyond. It's just the right distance from the sun or the right size. Everything seems to be here. It's like intrinsically planned. How does that connect again with maybe the whole medical field that, and you mentioned Rockefeller, and it's possibly part of that?
Great question, Peter. Again, we could talk deep into the night on that over a couple of beers, I'm sure. Where would I start? Yeah. So what you're describing is called the doctrine. It was called the doctrine of signatures. That God put things on the earth to cure every disease that might be recognizable. So if you take, for example, walnuts, walnuts, what do they look like?
A brain.
They look like a brain. Are walnuts, do they have the kind of fats in that are really good for your brain? Heck yes. It's really good brain food.
God makes it simple. It looks like a...
Now, I'm not saying I believe in the doctrine of signatures. I kind of don't really. But the idea that everything is there. Now, I've talked to Professor Angus Dalgleish at length, the oncologist. Fascinating videos. Watch them. Great scientist, great doctor. And, he's analyzed natural compounds So he started using thalidomide again, metronidazole, not metronidazole, fenbendazole, not
Yes.
fenbendazole, the other azole,
Yeah. Yeah.
mebendazole. Not that that's a natural compound. Ivermectin. And what you find with these natural compounds, ivermectin is a really good example. So ivermectin it's a bit like a penicillin for bacteria. It protects a particular sort of bacteria that's Antoscia moro, found on a particular golf course. He isolated these compounds called avermectins. A guy called William Campbell, no relation that I'm aware of, changed them into ivermectins. With that, they got rid of the river blindness and elephantiasis from the entire world. In the past, whole people groups would go blind and develop huge swollen limbs. All that's cured with ivermectin. But further analysis shows it actually works in so many different ways. It's got multiple biochemical pathways. So a lot of these natural compounds don't seem to work in one way. They can work in dozens of ways. And Professor Dalgleish was even telling me that some of them, you take them for a while, and then it works more when you stop taking it. It's all sorts of stuff that, this is not some bloke down the pub I'm talking to. This is this is some of the world's leading medical professors. Things that we really don't understand about pharmacology, but these multiple modalities of action. And what I think this comes down to is we're missing the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of things that are really easy to access. So, we know we need more vitamin D because we're not in the tropics and we live in cold northern latitudes. I'm even north of you. I can't possibly make any vitamin D throughout winter, or essentially not. So you've got to supplement it. Things that are fairly obvious and we should be doing. Things like not having food made in factories. I want my food made on proper farms and on allotments. Thank you very much. Getting rid of the ultra processed food, getting back to natural foods, the same as our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have eaten, is an interesting way to look at it. A food should look like a food. Not drinking excessive amounts, not abusing the body, certainly taking the right amount of exercise. All these things that very often isn't done because we just take a pill for every ill. But then when we start looking at compounds, there's a lot of really low-hanging fruit. So let me give you one firm example. My brother, and I've got his permission to share this, he was an academic like me. He was supervising 15 PhDs at the time, and he had a bad road traffic accident, and wasn't that bad actually. He kind of walked away from it, really. A couple of cracked ribs and the usual stuff, but he had what he called post-concussive disorder. His brain had been jiggled, and a couple of years after the accident, he was still getting lost in the car park at the supermarket. He still had to sleep all afternoon. He was still getting really bad headaches. He couldn't make a meal for the kids. He was basically a bit of an invalid, really. And he went to see the neurologist, the consultant, and he said, "Doctor, I want to get better. What do I do?" And this consultant neurologist said, "Well, get plenty of sleep, get some exercise, have a good nutritious diet." Basically had nothing to offer. So I started looking around, and I came across this substance called lion's mane. And I found out it's a mushroom.
Yes.
I found out that this lion's mane produces a couple of compounds that go across what we call the blood-brain barrier. So to protect the brain and the central nervous system, it's surrounded by this barrier so that toxins in the blood can't get into the brain. Alcohol's an exception because it's fat soluble, as is cannabis. But basically, it keeps toxins out of the brain, which is good because there's toxins in the blood, potentially all the time. So it crosses that blood-brain barrier. So it gets into the central nervous system when you eat this mushroom. And there, in vitro studies show that it produces something called nerve growth cytokine. It stimulates nerve growth cytokine. Now, when you're an 18-year-old psychiatric nurse, you're told that brain cells don't divide. That's why we get dementia. Dementia is a progressive, irreversible impairment of intellectual capacity. It's irreversible because the brain cells can't come back again. And that kind of makes sense. But lion's mane stimulates nerve growth cytokine, which does seem to. Now, whether it actually regenerates dead nerves, it may not. But what I'm convinced it does is it promotes the healing of damaged nerve fibers. And so we went to the Isle of Wight mushroom farm and we got some of this tincture. And I've since made friends with Alex on the Isle of Wight mushroom farm. I know he doesn't cheat. He's got good, he does good stuff. He makes proper tinctures in alcohol. Anyway, my brother started taking this, and I called him in about a week. He said, "You know what, John? I think I might be a bit better." I said, "Nah, no, just taking 4 mils of lion's mane tincture a day." He said, "Well, let's see. It tastes all right. I just take it with milk. I quite like it." Week after that, it was definitely improved. I could tell the conversations on the phone. Month after that, it was massively better. 2 months after that, he was about 30% better. Now, he wasn't back at work. He wasn't supervising PhDs, but he was reading articles in the Telegraph, which he couldn't have done before.
Yeah.
He was making meals for his kids. He was giving the kids a lift to school. He was doing odd jobs around the house for his wife. It basically gave him a large chunk of his life back. And I'm convinced that facilitated healing in the neural pathways. And according to the textbooks, that doesn't happen. And we're talking about a flipping mushroom here, for goodness sake.
I was going to say.
And
there isn't much money to be made for that, which
no.
maybe is why it's not put forward as a cure.
Yeah. But let me ask you an intellectual question, Peter. Who made mushrooms?
That would be God, would it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So has that compound been put there just waiting for us to discover it? Interesting idea, isn't it?
It is. It
really interesting idea. And there's other things. So ivermectin, for example. I never give medical advice, but I've had emails from, I don't want to exaggerate, but hundreds of people telling me they took ivermectin and it helped their cancers and didn't give them side effects. So obviously, this should be subject to large-scale randomized double-blind controlled trials as an emergency, because people are dying now. Every day, every week, probably pretty well every day, I get messages and appeals from people saying, "I've just been diagnosed with cancer, John. What should I take? My wife's just been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, John. I can't tell them. I can't do that. I don't know them. But their doctor should be able to. And we need large-scale trials on this. So we can say, you know what, that ivermectin stuff that comes from that bacteria that's on Toshiomoro, discovered in Japan, useless for cancer, doesn't work. Doesn't work. Or, you know what, this stuff works against a wide range of cancers that were previously untreatable. Now, to design a large-scale, double-blind, randomized controlled trial on that is easy. Heck, I could probably do it at a push. Any researcher, professional researchers could just sketch it out on the back of a fag packet in the pub, back of an envelope stuff. This is simple, straightforward stuff. Why isn't it being done? Why is this not being done? Science is based on the idea that someone notices something. So you go, that's interesting. That's interesting. This patient took this penicillin mold from a fungus. And you know what? The septic leg got better. I wonder if that was doing something. I wonder. And now we've got the same situation. I wonder if this ivermectin, this mebendazole, I wonder if it's doing something. Because, that bloke down there says it's cured his cancer. That's interesting, isn't it? I tell you what, that's interesting. That could benefit all of humanity. Let's do a randomized double-blind controlled trial. Why is this not happening?
No, on that, it's, I think, William Mackis, who I've had on before, and you look at what, and you think, I don't actually know if all of this is correct, but he's asking questions, he's talking about results, and he's kind of doing what big pharma, in theory, should be doing, but they obviously have decided it's not worth their while.
Who knows what their thinking is? I am just frustrated, angry, bemused by the fact that we have a simple, proven method for demonstrating the efficacy of medical interventions. We have a very powerful hypothesis here, and it's not being done. And I just think this is an outrage against everyone, against humanity. There are many. We could talk about many more. But why is this one not being done? It's really quite annoying. And when you get these desperate emails from people that you can't advise, that's what we're here for. We're here to go forward and develop. And why aren't the individual doctors curious? Why is this outbreak of mass curiosity deficit disorder, that we have abroad at the moment? Is it because they're too petrified to leave their guidelines? If so, we're not going to progress.
Yeah, well, thank God for doctors who ask questions outside maybe
Not enough of them.
what they've been told. Not. John, I really appreciate you coming on. It's just like been chatting with someone who I've got to know over the last few years, and really appreciate. And it's been fun going maybe a slightly different angle. The Turin Shroud was really fascinating. I watched that interview, and maybe looking at where faith and science through all of that. So, thank you so much for joining us on, I think, that little windy path of conversation that we've had. Really appreciate it.
Staying loyal to the principles of both. Science is good. Your worldview, your faith is good. They do intersect in a remarkably positive way. Such a pity, such a tragedy that people see a contradiction there.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the next video, we can talk about the sanctity of life, the threats to that.
That's part 2.
The assisted dying bill, the idea that abortion can be legal up to term. Terrifying ideas that are becoming normalized in our society, Peter.
It is terrifying. A little pushback, which is even more terrifying.
Most people are not questioning the outrageous.
I know. We forgot. We've lost the ability to ask questions and to question, and the groupthink. We've seen that. But Dr. John Campbell, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Peter. Great to talk.